Salamat pagi. Good morning. Thank you very much for the honor of being able to speak to you this morning. Please let me thank Dato Taslim for chairing the discussion. Thank you very much, Dato Taslim. Thank you, President Tanyu Singh, as well, for hosting us, for giving us this space and opportunity to speak to you. And thank you, all of you who are here to be part of this discussion. It is a great honor to be with you to discuss the challenge of living in a multicultural society. And there's no doubt that it does present challenges. And in Malaysia, you have done an extraordinary job over many, many years, despite challenges, of bringing together into one country people from an amazing diversity of religious communities and an amazing diversity of ethnic communities. You have a strong Muslim community, a strong Hindu community, a strong Christian community, a strong Buddhist community. And let me say it was a pleasure to meet Lo Pai Ling, the president of the Buddhist Missionary Society. It's wonderful to see so many different religious communities represented here. And I must say I have a special affection and admiration for Malaysia and for the wonderful multicultural society you have, because I spent summer in Malaysia 20 years ago in 1992. The first thing I did after graduating from university is spend a summer in Malaysia. And it was one of the high points of my life that summer. And I remember very vividly the warmth, the hospitality of the Malaysian people, all the Malaysian people. And so it's a wonderful honor to be able to be back here in Malaysia. And I didn't just enjoy the food. I did enjoy the food, but that wasn't the only thing. It was also the warmth and hospitality. My wife says I have a seafood diet. When I see food, I eat it. But I have a special love for Malaysian food, so it's great to be back here for that reason as well. Well, so we do have a challenge, and many countries around the world have a challenge of how to manage and promote freedom in the midst of multicultural diversity. And so what I'm going to do this morning is talk about the different approaches that countries around the world have taken to the challenge of multiculturalism, the challenge of having, managing a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. And there are many, many countries that really do see this as a growing challenge. I was in Nigeria last summer. Nigeria is facing growing challenges of managing its religious diversity, especially Christians and Muslims. I spend a lot of time in India. There are growing challenges there in managing a very religiously diverse country. You know, India is having elections right now in which religion is a major flashpoint and source of division. So this is a problem and a challenge all around the world. And the way I want to frame the discussion today is in terms of the fact that there really are two basic approaches to the challenge of living in a multicultural, multi-religious society. One basic approach is to see multicultural, multi-religious diversity as primarily a threat or a problem that has to be managed and contained. And once you see it as a threat or a problem, then the solution is to impose some kind of uniformity from the top, some kind of set of restrictions or constraints or regulations to make sure that the diversity does not get out of hand, to make sure that it does not jeopardize a kind of notion of homogeneity and unity. So that's one approach. Let's call it a regulatory approach, a top-down regulatory approach. Another approach is to have fewer restrictions. You could call this a deregulatory approach. You allow the diverse communities, religious groups, and ethnicities to find their own way of getting along, to have dialogue with each other in a context of freedom and basic rights, to allow communities to interact with each other, to allow communities to have open discussion with each other, even to allow communities to change their religion or their fundamental identity. So that is a deregulatory approach, an approach that does not impose heavy restrictions. And my purpose this morning is not to recommend one approach over another. I'm not going to prescribe one approach over another. I'm simply going to suggest that there's a great deal of social scientific evidence concerning the effects of these different approaches. We actually can, through scientific research, look and see the evidence in terms of what is the effect of these different approaches on social harmony. And we have a huge amount of evidence, and the evidence is from a think tank that I've been a part of in Washington called the Pew Research Center. It's not a governmental institution, it's a nonpartisan, independent think tank which has accumulated data on religion and politics in 197 countries in the world, all the countries in the world except North Korea. North Korea is left out because we do not have access to that society. It's an extremely closed society. It's impossible to get access to good information about what's happening in North Korea. Of course, we know it's one of the most repressive societies in the world, but that's the only country that's left out of the Pew Research data. And the Pew Research data essentially show, and this is the main point that I will be making, that societies that have more top-down restrictions and regulations on religion do not have more harmony, but have less harmony. So if a country like Malaysia, and you're having a debate now about national harmony and national unity, if a country like Malaysia, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society in which there's a high degree of religious diversity and a high degree of religious devotion, as Eric Treen just said a few minutes ago, if in the midst of that diversity Malaysia wants to advance harmony and unity, then you should think very carefully about whether you want to continue to pursue a top-down regulatory approach. Because the evidence from around the world, not just Western countries, but countries from around the world, is that countries that have a regulatory top-down approach tend to undermine social harmony. They have more tension, they have more violence, they have more internal disturbance. Now, it's important to emphasize this point because there's a widespread view that there's somehow a conflict between freedom and harmony. If you let people do what they want, then you're going to have problems, disunity, disharmony, violence. You can't let people do what they want because that will undermine harmony. And this is a widespread view around the world. To be honest, I think it's implicit in a lot of what has been said in Malaysia in defense of a National Harmony Act. The Right Honorable Prime Minister of Malaysia, in his speech in July 2012, Dato Sri Muhammad Najib said this in his speech. He said, "I need to emphasize that the freedom of speech and expression must always be balanced with the need to maintain harmony, peace, and public security." Well, the evidence that I'm going to discuss shows that you don't have to worry about a conflict or having a balance between freedom and harmony, because the best way to achieve harmony is to have more freedom. And I must say I was extremely impressed with the statement in your report. I believe this is the report that was produced in part by this coalition, Transforming the Nation, in which you said this in the section on nation building and democracy building. The recommendation 1 is nation building in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and multilingual society should not be intervened by cultural homogenization. National solidarity can only be achieved through the promotion and practice of equality, freedom, and respect for the rights of all communities. I could not have said that better myself. That's exactly right, and the evidence really strongly supports that. So let me just provide some of the data that the Pew Research Center has accumulated and some of the findings of research that I've been involved in. And the finding, again, the first finding is that more religious restrictions tend to undermine social harmony and increase social tension and violence. The other finding, which I'll briefly talk about, is that more religious restrictions on society also tend to undermine economic prosperity. So if a country wants to have more economic prosperity and development, it should promote more religious freedom, because religious regulation doesn't just have negative effects on religious relations, but more religious regulation also tends to undermine a vital, dynamic economy. So I'll discuss that as well. Well, I said earlier that there are two kinds of approaches to the challenge of multiculturalism. One kind of approach is to have more restrictions. Another kind of approach is to have fewer restrictions. And we see, in fact, in the world, two different kinds of countries, basically. Countries that are adopting more restrictions on religion and countries that have fewer restrictions. The countries in red are countries that have, or orange, are countries that have high or very high restrictions on religion. You can see they're concentrated, in fact, in Asia and North Africa. This is based on the Pew data. The Pew Research Center measures different kinds of government restrictions, in fact measures 20 different kinds of government restrictions on religion. And for every country in the world, as I said earlier, except North Korea, it provides a systematic analysis of how many restrictions every country has, not just frozen in time, but across time. So the Pew Center has accumulated data and has shown trends all around the world for the last 6 years. And it looks at things like, does the Constitution protect freedom of religion? Are there legal limits on public preaching? Is religious conversion allowed? Is religious education required in public school? Does the government officially denounce cults or sects? And are there heavy registration requirements for religious groups? There are many other restrictions as well, which I'll get to in a moment. So based on those kinds of criteria, Pew divides the world into different categories. Some countries have many, many restrictions, and those are the countries in red. Other countries, including many countries in Africa, actually, South America, the Americas, some countries in Western Europe, these countries have lower restrictions on religion. This is a list of the countries in the world that have the highest government restrictions on religion. These are the highest of the high countries. And you'll see that Malaysia is one of the countries in the world that has among the highest restrictions on religion. It is in the neighborhood of countries like Pakistan, Russia, and it's in the same category as countries like China in Asia. So just as an objective fact, Malaysia ranks extremely high globally in its formal, official, political, government, top-down regulation of religion. Now, this is not a normative or evaluative point. There may be justification for some restrictions, but just as an objective fact, Malaysia has a very, very large number of government restrictions on religion. Now, the question is, what do we know about the impact of these restrictions? When we look around the world, do countries with more restrictions tend to have more social harmony, or do they have less social harmony? The argument in Malaysia often in favor of more restriction is that we need these restrictions because that's the only way to achieve national harmony. We don't want people to be offended, we don't want people to be upset, so we need to put controls on what people can say and what people can do. So the argument is that we need to have these controls, as the Honorable Prime Minister said a couple of years ago. We need to balance. We can't have too much freedom because, well, then harmony will be upset. Well, what's the evidence? Well, in a nutshell, the evidence is very, very clear. Government restrictions do not work. If the justification for government restrictions on religion is that they promote religious harmony, that is false. It's empirically false. It is not true. Countries that have higher levels of government restrictions on religion tend to have higher levels of social tension, violence, and disharmony around religions. It's just a fact. First, I just want to point out, in terms of the trend, that more and more countries are trying the route of imposing restrictions. In 2007, about 29% of the world's countries had high or very high restrictions on religion. Now, in the most recent year that we have data for, 43% of countries now have high restrictions on religion. So we actually have a larger number of countries in which to test whether restrictions are actually limiting tension or violence, or whether restrictions are actually having the opposite effect. This is another chart which shows that a large number of countries, almost 50% of the world's countries, have seen increases in restrictions on religion. Large numbers of countries, much fewer countries are seeing decreases in restrictions. More countries are moving towards a regulatory, top-down, restrictive model than are moving towards a free model. Well, and just one piece of evidence to suggest that more restrictions are not necessarily bringing about a more harmonious world is that even as more of the world is becoming more restrictive in terms of religion, we are actually seeing higher levels of religious violence in the world. So that's already one piece of evidence to suggest that even as the world is becoming more regulatory and restrictive in religion, we are not seeing a decrease in religious violence or terrorism. And just to get deeper into this, we have a lot of evidence concerning what the Pew Research Center calls social hostilities involving religion. In other words, Pew measures not just government restrictions on religion, it also measures the number of incidents of violence in society involving religion. And it measures lots of different categories, and I'll go into detail into these categories in a moment. But this map shows the number of countries in red, again, and in orange that have high or very high social hostilities involving religion. And if you remember the map I showed you a few minutes ago, you'll notice that many of the same countries that have high government restrictions, guess what, have high social hostilities involving religion, which is to say that these government restrictions are not eliminating the social hostilities involving religion, and I will suggest in a moment that these restrictions are actually exacerbating levels of social hostility involving religion. So look at the strong parallel. Many of the same countries that have high restrictions have high social hostilities. These are the countries in the world that have the highest levels of social hostility involving religion. You can see the list is growing. In only 1 year, the list of countries with high social hostilities, very high in fact, has almost doubled from 2011 to 2012. Many, many new countries have joined the list, including a number of Asian countries, Burma, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, all of which, or most of which, have fairly high levels of government restriction as well. Well, these are some of the examples of the kinds of social hostilities involving religion that Pew measures. They measure whether a country has incidents of violence motivated by religion, whether there are religious-related terrorist groups, whether there is violence used to enforce religious norms, whether there is hostility over proselytizing or conversion, whether women are harassed for violating religious dress codes. There's many different criteria that Pew measures to determine whether there is social hostility involving religion. And I first want to point out, before we discuss more of the relationship between government restriction and social hostility involving religion, I just want to point out that as we see a growth in the harassment of religion around the world, more groups are victims of violence of various sorts. It's important to recognize that all religious groups are in one way or another victims of violence and restriction and harassment because of their religion. Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Christians in many, many countries face some kind of harassment or another. Christians and Muslims are the groups that face more harassment in more countries than any other group. That's partly because they're the largest religions in the world by far, and they're also the most globally dispersed. But Buddhists and Hindus also face discrimination and harassment in a very large number of countries around the world. Jews also face discrimination in a very large number of countries. So we're not just talking about one religion or another being victimized by harassment around the world. Well, so what is the relationship between government restriction and social hostility? This chart very dramatically demonstrates the kind of relationship I want to suggest is going on in the world today. This chart puts all of the 25 most populous countries in the world on a on a 2-by-2 axis. On one axis, there is a measure of social hostilities, and on the other axis is a measure of government restrictions. So in other words, every country is plotted on this chart in terms of both government restrictions and social hostilities. And you immediately see something very, very interesting. You see two kinds of countries, essentially. You see countries with relatively low government restrictions. In other words, the further you are to the left, the lower is the country's government restrictions. So you see a number of countries that have very, very low government restrictions. Brazil, Japan, Congo, Philippines, South Africa. Very different countries. They're different continents, different cultures, different religions. It doesn't really matter. That's not the important thing. But all these countries have one thing in common. They have low restrictions on government. And, well, what else do they have in common? They have very low social hostilities involving religion. So the further you get to the left, in other words, the lower the government restrictions, the lower a country's level of social hostilities. And conversely, the further you get to the right, the higher you go in terms of restrictions, the higher you go in terms of social hostilities. There is an almost linear relationship, if you remember your mathematics, between government restriction of religion and social hostility involving religion. In other words, many of these countries may have very good intentions. Their hope is that if we regulate and restrict and control, that we will reduce tension. But that is not what is happening. Countries that try to restrict religion tend to increase the levels of social hostility. And I should emphasize, this is not just countries like India and China or Egypt and Indonesia, but countries like France and Germany and the UK have growing restrictions on religion, and those restrictions are not improving religious tension, but increasing religious tension. I'll just provide one spectacular, very important example. France. France, in the last 10 years, has moved towards a more and more regulatory, restrictive approach to religion. Most interestingly, a couple of years ago, the entire French National Assembly, in a vote that was overwhelming, passed an outright ban on the wearing of the full-length burqa by Muslim women in France. It is illegal in public in France to wear the full-length burqa. You can be arrested on the Champs-Élysées if you are wearing the full-length burqa, and women are being arrested and stopped by police if they wear the full-length burqa. We know that that restriction, even though it was designed to improve social harmony in France, is it having that effect? No. Muslims are more resentful, Muslims are more alienated, and there is more religious and ethnic tension in France now because of that very restrictive policy. Was the policy well-intentioned? Yes. Was the policy designed in part to promote national unity and harmony? Yes. Is the policy having the effect of promoting national unity and harmony? No. It's increasing tension, as you can see. As France has moved towards more restrictions, France has shot up in terms of its social hostilities involving religion. So France has now extremely high levels of social hostility involving religion. And you can imagine drawing a line, that really shows this linear relationship. Well, while we're waiting for this, let me just address the question, well, why should this be? Why should more government restriction lead to more social hostility? There are many different dynamics that are going on, but there are a couple of important points to make. One is that I think what we're seeing in many, many different countries is that the more government tries to promote particular laws or policies around religion designed to reduce religious tension, the more these policies actually draw society's attention to those divisions. So the opposite effect from what's intended is occurring. The government may hope that imposing a certain policy will actually create more harmony or tension or stop behavior that it deems divisive or in some way disharmonious, but actually the policies tend to focus more attention on the division, and people become even more divided around that issue. Another thing that often happens is that in response to an incidence of religious violence or tension, the government may seek to clamp down. But often what happens is that when the government clamps down, the groups that are experiencing conflict, or the religious group that might be a source of some division, doesn't respond to the restriction by reducing its activism, but becomes more activist in response. So the tensions and religious divisions, instead of decreasing, actually increase. And then, when the government sees the tensions increase, the government imposes even more restrictions. And then the groups respond with even more activism and more aggression. And so you have a vicious cycle where government restrictions lead to more tensions, which then lead to more restrictions, which lead to more tensions, which lead to more restrictions. You're seeing this in China, by the way. China is increasingly nervous about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. China is increasingly nervous about the spread of house churches, which have grown exponentially. In the next 20 years, China may have the world's largest Christian population, larger than the United States, according to really distinguished sociologists that I've spoken to. And China is very, very nervous. So China is imposing more restrictions on religion. What's the effect of these restrictions? The effect is actually to make many of the groups in question more resentful, and the groups are responding critically. And then China is imposing more restrictions, and the groups are becoming more violent. And just a few weeks ago, we saw a massive stabbing attack by Uyghur Muslims, which killed dozens of people. And in response, the government is imposing more restrictions. So there's a vicious cycle. Government restriction actually has the opposite effect. Well, and we can see just in very specific terms that specific government restrictions are associated with very high levels of social hostility and tension. This chart lists all of the different types of government restrictions that you can have on religion. These are specific government policies that restrict religion that you see all around the world. So that's that column. The middle column shows for each restriction the average level of social hostility in society involving religion in countries that have that restriction. Does that make sense? So, with respect to the first restriction is very high government favoritism of one religion over another. So all of the countries in the world, and there are many countries in the world that have policies of high favoritism towards one religion over another, those countries have an average level of social hostility of almost 5 on the Pew Research Center score. Countries that don't have that restriction have levels of social hostility of 1.3. In other words, countries that have higher levels of government favoritism have between 4 and 5 times the level of social hostility involving religion than countries that do not have that restriction. Countries in which there are many cases of government force toward religious groups, those countries have much higher levels of social tension involving religion. Countries in which the government does not intervene in religious discrimination to protect groups from invidious or unfair discrimination. Countries where the government does not do that have much higher levels of social tension involving religion. Governments that limit religious conversion have much higher levels of social tension involving religion. Countries that limit proselytizing have about twice the levels of social tension involving religion than countries that do not have any limits on proselytizing. And you can see the dramatic effect. In other words, there is no case where countries that have the given government restriction have fewer social hostilities. In every case where a country has the given government restriction, that country has higher levels of social tension involving religion. In other words, there is no example of a government restriction on religion that has the effect of improving social tensions involving religion. They all tend to increase the levels of social hostility and tension involving religion. In just a few minutes, I want to make my second point. My first big point is, again, that government restrictions on religion do not have the effect of improving social harmony. They have the effect of diminishing social harmony and increasing social tension. Another striking finding from a growing body of social scientific research, including research in economics, is that countries that have more restrictions on religion also hamper and limit their economic development and innovation and growth as well. Why is that? Well, economic development, economic growth is driven by new ideas. It's driven by risk-taking. Religious freedom promotes economic advancement by boosting other freedoms that are essential to economic development. The members of a society in which religious freedoms are respected will find it more natural to respect political, artistic, and social freedoms. And in addition, countries that have more religious freedom will tend to be more likely to attract entrepreneurial talent from people from many different religious backgrounds and communities. Countries that have higher levels of religious restriction tend to encourage people who are not part of the dominant religion to leave if they can. Higher levels of religious restriction tend to discourage development of human capital in terms of creativity and innovation. If people are stifled in terms of their religious thinking, they tend to be stifled in terms of their economic thinking as well. They tend not to be less creative and innovative in other areas as well. Religious restrictions also diminish trust between religious groups because many of these restrictions are designed to limit, for example, conversion. And proselytism, which actually tends to diminish relationships across religious divides. And therefore there's less trust, therefore there's less social capital, and where there's less trust in social capital, we know economic research shows economies don't function as well. They're less efficient, there are higher transaction costs. People do not cooperate on common economic enterprises. So the data show, and I can provide this to anybody who's interested, there's a very high correlation between countries with higher religious freedom and higher economic development. Countries with lower religious freedom have much lower overall economic development. This is true historically. There are many historic examples of countries in Western Europe that had lower levels of religious freedom and therefore suffered economically. France kicked out all of its Protestants in the late 17th century, and those Protestant entrepreneurs, many of them were the best industrialists and economic leaders in France. They left France and went to other countries. France suffered economically, lost 200,000 of its best citizens, most industrious, hardworking citizens, and France's economy declined, its status in Europe declined, its geopolitical standing declined, and those countries that had religious freedom, that welcomed those Protestants, increased in their economic development, growth, and power. Many of those people went to the Netherlands, which had more religious freedom, and so the Netherlands, even though it was a tiny country, surged ahead of Spain, France, and other countries. Why? Because they were smarter? Because they were harder working? No, because they had religious freedom. I don't want to suggest that there is a kind of clash between a kind of Western model and an Asian model. Some people, including in this country, have tried to criticize Western values in favor of Asian values. Religious freedom is also an Asian value. There are many Asian countries that practice high levels of religious freedom. One country is Japan. And Japan, as a consequence, has lower levels of social hostility involving religion and very high economic growth, very high levels of stability. It is a religiously diverse society with Buddhists, Shinto, a strong Christian minority that has been there for a long time. Japan did not used to have high levels of religious freedom. Japan traditionally had state Shinto. The Shinto religion was firmly embedded in the Japanese state. It was the favored religion of Japan. People who did not subscribe to it used to be persecuted violently. The Christian minority in Japan was persecuted violently up until the middle of the 19th century. Japan decided to change its model. It went from a regulatory, restrictive model to a non-regulatory, free model. And the result is that Japan has much lower levels of social tension and hostility involving religion. Despite the fact that in some instances Japan has faced dangerous cults and groups that have actually threatened social harmony. You may remember the Shinriko cult in the 1990s perpetrated a violent terrorist attack in the Tokyo subway system, killing many people. Japan did not respond to that with a national harmony bill. It did not impose restrictions on religion. It criminally prosecuted the people responsible for the attack, but maintained a high degree of religious freedom, which allowed the country to get past those tensions in a way that actually enhanced stability and as well as freedom. Other Asian countries, though, have not followed the route of Japan, and one country that stands out is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is very similar to Malaysia, as you know. It's dominated by an ethnic group that has mostly one religion, the Sinhalese Buddhist majority. And starting in the 1950s, Sri Lanka went towards a more hegemonic model. Through a number of very restrictive policies, Sri Lanka decided to make Sri Lanka a country that would favor one group, the Sinhalese Buddhists, despite opposition from Tamils and others who did not like that kind of hegemonic model. And Sri Lanka went so far as imposing a constitution in 1971 that made Buddhism the foremost religion of Sri Lanka, officially, for the first time, which is why the name of the country changed from Ceylon to Sri Lanka. And the policies of the country became more and more restrictive, both ethnically and religiously. And Sri Lanka also imposed affirmative action policies designed to defend and promote the Sinhalese over the Tamils. And as a consequence, Sri Lanka eventually created more division, more tension. These policies designed to promote unity actually created more division. And as you know how the story ended. It did not end well. These policies generated a civil war, which killed more than 100,000 people. Massive human rights violations were committed in the last stages of the war. And Sri Lanka still has very high government restrictions on religion and has growing religious tensions around religion as well, involving attacks on Muslims, Christians, and others. In fact, Sri Lanka's levels of restriction and social hostility compare to levels of the Middle East and North Africa. So in a sense, Malaysia has a choice. There are two Asian models. Malaysia could choose a Japanese model, or Malaysia could choose a Sri Lankan model. We know what model Malaysia has been choosing the last few years. Malaysia, in fact, has very high levels of government restriction on religion. Malaysia has levels of government restriction that, in fact, are even higher than Sri Lanka's levels. Malaysia has very high scores on almost all of the 20 kinds of government restriction on religion that I showed earlier. The levels have been very high the last few years. There's been a little bit of fluctuation, I think in part because of fluctuations at the state level. Here and there have been some changes, but basically there's been overall a kind of stability at a very, very high level. And so we can ask, well, in Malaysia, maybe in Malaysia it's working. Maybe you're having less religious tension in Malaysia because of these restrictions. Well, the evidence is actually, by the way, yeah, this is the chart that I showed before. Malaysia has, some of the highest levels of restriction in the world. Well, is this working? Well, no, it's not working. The levels of social hostility involving religion in Malaysia have gone up dramatically. In the last several years. They've almost quadrupled since 2007. So policies of religious restriction are not working in Malaysia. Malaysia is kind of trying the Sri Lankan model in some respects of promoting one kind of ethnic group, frankly, over one kind of religion over others, a system that is really intrinsically unequal. And that inequality is embedded into the system in many respects. And is that system benefiting the harmony of the country? No, it's demonstrably not benefiting the harmony of the country. Now you can see that compared to other Asia-Pacific countries, too, Malaysia has very high levels of government restriction, really, in fact, out of the Asian norm in some respects. The Philippines has much lower government restrictions. And, by the way, Philippines has lower government restrictions and lower social hostilities, even though they've had an insurgency. The Philippines has had an open religious insurgency. Despite that, Philippines has lower levels of government restrictions and lower levels of social hostilities involving religion. Singapore has lower levels of government restriction of religion than Malaysia. It's still fairly high. The social hostilities are fairly low, but they've been increasing in recent years in Singapore, in part because Singapore has such high government restrictions on religion, but still they're lower than Malaysia. In fact, Malaysia is following the Chinese model, you could say. Malaysia's restrictions on religion are comparable to those of communist China. Well, so in conclusion, the conventional wisdom is wrong. The conventional wisdom is that you have to impose heavy regulations and restrictions to have more harmony, but actually the facts show that is not true. The more restrictions you have, the less harmony you have. If Malaysia wants to seize the opportunity to see its multicultural diversity as an opportunity and not a threat, if Malaysia wants to trust its people to learn how to get along themselves without being managed paternalistically by the state, then Malaysia will see great improvements, I believe, in terms of its social harmony, social trust, religious relations, and its economic innovation as well. Malaysia will be able to advance on every front with greater freedom and fewer government restrictions on religion. Thank you very much.